Hello and welcome to the Best Practices Summit. Pollinator Friendly Alliance is a grassroots 501c3 nonprofit that protects the natural world through the conservation of pollinators. Our co-host is the Xerces Society, a science-based nonprofit.
And thank you everybody for being here today. My name is Jennifer Hopwood. I'm with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and I am talking about things that are on the verge today, which include roadsides and pollinator conservation. And as you've probably heard from a number of my really wonderful colleagues today and yesterday, Xerces Society is a nonprofit conservation organization, and we focus on invertebrate protection and habitat protection and approach invertebrate conservation through education and outreach and research and community science and habitat restoration on the ground. And as you probably have already seen from the breadth of our experience, we work in a variety of landscapes, including roadsides. And we have offices around the country. I'm based in Omaha, Nebraska. And we're all here today because pollinators are in trouble. And we know that at least 18% of butterfly species and about 28% of bumblebee species in the United States face some degree of extinction risk. And there's at least one imperiled pollinator species in every single state in the United States. And we also know that every single pollinator can be important. Having a diverse community of pollinators is really critical for the health of wild plant communities. And it's also really valuable for crop pollination. And about 30 years ago, biologist Paul Ehrlich was trying to figure out ways to talk to the public about the importance of biodiversity. At that point, it was just a new concept. And so he likened it to an airplane. And if you're a passenger in an airplane and you're looking out the window, you can see that maybe there might be a few rivets missing from the wing, but you're not super concerned about that at that point because there are plenty of other rivets to hold the wing together. But as the trip goes on and you keep losing rivets, at some point there's going to be a rivet that's lost and a crash of the plane becomes inevitable. And so that's really more traditionally how we've thought of biodiversity, that our systems, whether they're natural systems or agricultural systems, are fairly robust to the loss of individual species and even to multiple species. But when it comes to pollinators, there's evidence that suggests that in some systems, losing one species can change pollinator dynamics enough to change plant reproduction and even ecosystem functioning. So thinking about the loss of biodiversity is really, really critical when it comes to pollinators. And back in 2014, then President Obama sent out a presidential memorandum that focused on pollinator health. In particular, recognized that pollinators are really critical for our agricultural systems and for our health and our economy. And in this memo, he tasked federal agencies with identifying opportunities to increase support for pollinators and to also identify the ways in which they were already supporting pollinators. And one of these agencies included the Department of Transportation and Federal Highway Administration. And their job was to figure out ways to increase pollinator habitat along roadways and to help implement improvements and support states in promoting pollinator-friendly practices. And so that set in chain a motion of activity that brought several state DOTs became more interested in pollinators at that point, and since then a whole bunch have really become more interested and engaged in pollinator conservation. And Xerces was part of a collaboration with Federal Highway Administration to identify and look at the relationship between roadsides and pollinators. To summarize that, and then also look at conservation practices that DOTs could implement to improve roadsides for pollinators. So I'm going to pull from that summary of the science today, which you can find on Federal Highway Administration's website. And I'm also going to run through some recommended conservation practices that came out of that work back in 2015, 2016, but also some more recent work that we've done through the National Cooperative Highway Research Program. All of the work that we've done on roadsides has been informed by science, but also by roadside practitioners who've weighed in on how to implement it and if it's how to make it possible and feasible and under different circumstances. And just to start, pollinators use roadsides. They use roadsides whether we want them to or not. They can be really important habitat for pollinators. Roadsides can extend across a variety of landscapes, through rural landscapes, through urban landscapes, and within some really highly altered landscapes, roadsides can be hotspots of diversity, hosting some of the only natural vegetation within that landscape. And for some listed and imperiled pollinators, roadsides actually are some of the last remaining places of their habitat. And just for an example, if you live in the Corn Belt and you're looking to go find some native plants or find a remnant prairie, the chances are some of those last remaining places are on roadsides, those places that weren't plowed and planted. There are also about 10 million acres of roadsides in the United States, so it can be a significant conservation opportunity to increase the quality of that for pollinators. And roadsides can support pollinators in several different ways. First of all, they provide pollinators with food because roadside flowering plants provide pollen and nectar for adult pollinators. Roadsides also support vegetation that can serve as host plants for butterflies and moths, and can also support the larvae of other pollinators like beetles and flies. We know that pollinator abundance and diversity is greater on roadsides that have more native plants than on roadsides that are dominated by non-native species. And roadsides are also a place where pollinators find shelter or breed or overwinter. Bees and wasps nest in roadsides, either in the ground or above ground in stems or in cavities. And flies, beetles, moths, and butterflies overwinter in roadsides as well in a whole variety of locations. And some species of pollinators use roadsides for just a portion of their life cycle, maybe as a place to forage and then breed elsewhere or overwinter elsewhere. But others depend on the roadside for their entire life cycle. Roadsides can also help pollinators move through landscapes. They have the potential to act as stepping stones or as corridors to connect existing habitat patches. And in several instances, roadsides have actually helped certain species expand their ranges. So as flowers have moved along roadsides, so too have the pollinators that depend on those. And that might become increasingly important in the face of climate change, as plants might alter their distributions in the future. Increasing corridors might become incredibly important for pollinators. But with all the advantages of roadsides, there are some unique threats associated with roads that pollinators face. Like other animals that move through landscapes, pollinators are killed by collisions with vehicles, for one. In general, pollinators are killed across a wide range of road types and traffic on county roads with slow traffic. But in general, there's a little bit more mortality at higher traffic volumes and on wider roads and higher densities of roads. Maybe not as much as you might think, but definitely a trend in that direction. More mobile species have higher rates of mortality because they're moving more and interacting more with roads. Some species have hot spots of mortality, also like some mammals do. For example, monarch butterflies appear to have higher rates of mortality in the fall when they're funneling through Texas and northern Mexico, and their flight routes intersect with certain landscape features that might force them to go across a particular road. For example, if a canyon funnels them through in really high densities across a road, that can be really problematic for vehicle collisions. Overall, estimates of relative roadkill range from about 0.6 to 7% of the population that uses the roadsides. So it's not a huge chunk of the population. Is probably not having it, probably having little impact on populations. Another threat to pollinators associated with roads are contamination that come directly from roads and road traffic. This includes turbulence, noise, dust, as well as salts applied to the road for safety to prevent ice from building up, and also heavy metal that's released through combustion. Salts and heavy metals are the biggest risk from this level of contamination. They can move from the roads into vegetation and then into pollinators. And a lot of the research from on salts and heavy metals is coming from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Emily Snell-Rude is doing a lot of this work, which has really been needed for a long time. It looks like right now, exposure of salts and heavy metals is highest directly adjacent to the road and the vegetation that's directly adjacent, and then it tapers off as it moves further into the roadside. And in most instances, salts don't appear to occur in vegetation at levels that are harmful to pollinators in most spaces. But both salts and heavy metals are higher in areas of higher traffic. So that's where the risk of exposure to pollinators becomes the greatest. Dust and noise don't appear to have any impacts on pollinators in the long term. And how roadsides are managed can mitigate some of these threats, mitigate vehicle collisions and exposure to pollution. So for example, vehicle collision mortality is reduced with wider roadsides, as well as with higher plant diversity and less frequent mowing. So the wider the roadside you have, the fewer pollinators are killed. The more diverse vegetation present, the fewer pollinators are killed by traffic. And the less often mowing is conducted, fewer pollinators are killed. And this is really opposite of what a common concern might be, that it's often thought that if you increase the quality of habitat on a roadside, that you're going to draw in more pollinators and increase collisions by drawing in more pollinators. But it's really the opposite of the case. The higher quality roadside you have, the fewer pollinator deaths you have due to vehicle collisions. One asterisk to that, though, is that there's a need to understand the role that flowering medians might play on mortality. We just don't really have enough research to understand if those might be more harmful than good at this point. When it comes to exposure to pollution, plant diversity can also buffer the effects of toxicity because different plants uptake different salts and metals at different rates. So having different plants available for pollinators to use can be really valuable in that instance as well. And you can also prioritize habitat away from the direct pavement edge, which often is mowed for safety and recovery anyway. And if you're prioritizing new plantings, prioritize those in areas away from really excessively busy interchanges, for example, to have lower traffic densities and lower pollution. And not all roadsides are equally valuable to pollinators. It's really dependent on the vegetation that you've got present. So if you've got Kentucky bluegrass, and it's really just a monoculture of Kentucky bluegrass that doesn't support many pollinators at all. But it isn't just the vegetation that's present, it's also how the vegetation is maintained that can influence pollinators on roadsides. And I'm going to focus on how pollinators can be integrated into maintenance practices, into the design of revegetation as well, and in public affairs from here on out. When we were interviewing staff from departments of transportation, one thing we heard again and again is that they recognized that there was really high quality existing vegetation on roadsides, or even moderate quality vegetation on roadsides, and that it was really important to manage that effectively to best support pollinators rather than trying to replace it. They had existing habitat, and if they could just manage it better, that would be a really key step. And one component of managing different portions of roadsides with different qualities is to recognize what you have and to start with a vegetation inventories to map out where you might have remnant communities, as well as where you might have emergent noxious and invasive weed issues. And then all that data can be used to develop management plans and management objectives, and then can help you over time as you continue to do monitoring to evaluate the efficacy of that management, and can really lead into some informed adaptive management activities. And when it comes to maintenance, mowing is one of the most important tools that are used to control undesirable vegetation on roadsides. It can be used to support plant diversity by reducing encroaching woody plants. Like in where I'm based, eastern red cedar is a really big problem because it can invade roadsides and other open spaces and quickly crowd out other beneficial plants. And eastern red cedar can be a crash hazard on roadsides. So mowing can also reduce noxious weeds as well. And by removing those plants that suppress diverse communities, that can be really beneficial to pollinators. But mowing can have some negative impacts as well. And if you're mowing during the growing season, that can kill caterpillars that are feeding on vegetation. It can destroy above ground bumblebee nests. And it also temporarily removes flowering plants that provide food sources for pollinators. An excessive mowing 3 or more times a growing season can really reduce vegetative quality of roadsides over time because flowers just don't have the opportunity to bloom and to produce seeds. So slowly they'll just get mown out. And this is another instance in which DOT staff recognized that reducing mowing was one of the most important steps that they could make. We heard again and again, we've got wildflowers out on the landscape. We just need to stop mowing them down. And ways to adjust mowing practices to support pollinators can be figuring out how to reduce the frequency of mowing. So limiting mowing to no more than twice a growing season, for example, or even less. In some regions, you might be able to mow every other year or just once a year, depending on weed pressure. Mowing only when there's a defined objective. If you need to clear brush or to maintain sight lines, you might mow one side of the road at a time, or to mow in swaths using rotational mowing to leave some existing vegetation standing. Reducing the frequency of mowing in the roadside doesn't apply to the safety zone or the clear zone or recovery zone, that strip of vegetation right up next to the pavement. That's what's illustrated here. This mower is just mowing the first several feet, and that zone can range anywhere from 5 feet wide to 15 feet wide, depending on the roadside and the Department of Transportation. But that needs to be mown regularly for safety reasons. But beyond that, all that vegetation is out there, and it's worth figuring out ways to reduce how often that's mown. And mowing can also be adjusted to support pollinators by thinking about the timing of when mowing occurs. So it might be conducting mowing at a time when you don't remove flowering plants, blooming plants. For example, postponing mowing until after the first frost, or avoiding key periods when imperiled pollinators are vulnerable to mowing, such as when their caterpillar stage of butterflies are feeding on vegetation. It can be tricky to balance timing of mowing with pollinator resource needs as well as other management objectives. So it can be a bit of a balancing act for sure. And just a quick example of how you can use management windows to conduct mowing outside of the vulnerable times for a particular species. This is the otoskipper. It's an imperiled species of butterfly that's found in prairie regions. And its adult flies from the end of May into August, and its caterpillar is actively feeding and growing between mid-June and mid-September. So if you were to come through in July and conduct a mow on a roadside when this caterpillar is present, that would very much imperil the survival of that population. But if you mow outside of that activity period in May or at the end of September, early October, that would allow the vulnerable stage, the caterpillars, to fully develop and enter into their overwintering phase before the maintenance is conducted. I have a couple quick examples about methods that DOTs have used to reduce mowing. The first is a very passive method and came about because the state of Kansas had some pretty severe budget cuts that affected their transportation agency. They were forced to reduce mowing, and where they might have mowed once every year from fence to fence of the roadside, they ended up needing to mow every other year, or in some cases where weed pressure allowed every 4 years on a rotational basis. And one side benefit was that wildflowers started to emerge and flourish in places they hadn't seen before, where they'd been conducting mowing in August, for example. The sunflowers that you see here hadn't previously been allowed to bloom. The state of Illinois, their Department of Transportation, became interested in proactively providing habitat for monarch butterflies after monarchs were petitioned for listing as a threatened species. And they just became really passionate about that and joined in the recent the candidate conservation agreement that is for transportation agencies and utility corridors. And as part of that, they developed some reduced mowing strategies to support monarchs. They only routinely mow 15 feet from the road itself, so from the pavement. That's their safety recovery zone. So they mow that on a regular basis, but beyond that, they use rotational mowing 1/3 every year, rotating which strip they mow in any given year. And so they always have some standing vegetation, and noted that they've seen an increase in milkweed stems and wildflowers through that process so far. And in Florida, they have a much longer growing season than I'm used to, for sure. So their DOT mows anywhere from 7 to 15 or 18 times a growing season, just depending on where they're located. They conducted a pilot study to look at mowing just once a year in the fall beyond the clear zone, and noted that they saved $1,000 per mile per year. And of course, saw an increase in diversity and abundance in wildflowers due to that reduced mowing. So there are some cost savings that can be seen through reduced mowing, as well as increased wildflowers. Other benefits include reduced soil compaction, because you have fewer heavy equipment moving through that roadside on a regular basis. Protects grassland birds that are nesting in that roadside as well, and reduce carbon emissions. Herbicides are also a tool that's used often in roadside vegetation management to suppress noxious and invasive plants and other problematic plants. And some herbicides do have direct toxicity to pollinators, particularly to some caterpillars, some species of caterpillars that consume plants that have herbicide residues on them. But the largest impact of herbicides is indirect, by removing nectar sources of host plants that serve as food for pollinators, they either need to move on, or if their food is removed, caterpillars starve. And broadcast use of a broad spectrum herbicides can, over time, reduce stand diversity and weaken that stand of vegetation, making it more vulnerable to invasion. So there are a couple ways to use herbicides to reduce the risk to pollinators. Using herbicides within an integrated vegetation management plan, an integrated approach that incorporates a range of methods to prevent and manage weeds and problematic vegetation, so that herbicides fit into that larger picture, that larger management plan. Emily May had a really nice presentation yesterday on the topic. If you missed it, I believe there's a recording that will come out later. And this is another instance in which inventories can be really beneficial, because they can help identify emerging weed issues. And so you can take early action to manage those weed issues and reduce outbreaks. And so you can also use your efforts to manage those weeds to help evaluate the effectiveness of those management techniques and adapt as needed over time. Herbicides can be used in direct, highly targeted applications to problematic plants. If you can use them in that way, you can avoid weakening non-target species that pollinators are more likely to use and benefit from. So avoiding broadcast treatments whenever possible, except for dense infestations. And if you are treating a dense infestation, consider reseeding that area afterwards if the seed bank is depleted with native plants, so that it's not subject to further encroachment from other weeds. And to limit drift, you can choose and calibrate equipment that is appropriate for drift management. Prioritize herbicides with low volatility, so they're less likely to move off-site. And avoid applications when the wind is over 50 miles per hour, or during a temperature inversion, when it's more likely for the herbicide to move long distances. It can also be really important to time applications of herbicides to reduce risk to pollinators. So this might be to treat plants when pollinators aren't present, but it can also be to treat the plants when they're most vulnerable, when they're in the stage when they're most going to be affected by the herbicide. So for many, this might be the seedling stage or the rosette stage. It can also be helpful to use herbicides in combination with another management technique, for example, to follow up a mow with herbicide treatment to certain plants. When the plants are cut, they're more likely to uptake the herbicide and really feel the impacts, for example. And treating before the plants are blooming or setting seed is really important, so that you don't contribute to the weed seed bank. Training is a key aspect of herbicides, using it wisely, of course, training staff and contractors to apply it effectively. But it can also be important to provide training to contractors and staff to help them recognize non-target plants or sensitive plant species and tell the difference from problematic vegetation. For example, it's helpful to distinguish native thistles from introduced species that need controlling. Pictured here, this is tall thistle, Tertium altissimum, and it's really abundant in August here in eastern Nebraska and western Iowa. It's not a species that needs controlling. It's not aggressive and invading at all. And it's a really important nectar source for bumblebees and for migrating monarch butterflies. So if you're a manager, you don't want to spend money controlling a plant and getting herbicides out into the environment on a plant that doesn't need controlling. So it's a real advantage to be able to tell the difference between noxious weeds and invasive species and native plants. And plant ID skills are valuable for professional development for staff as well. They can take those skills and apply them down the road in other ways. So including specifications and contracts. If your maintenance staff are contractors primarily, you can also hold them accountable through those specifications to reduce damage to non-target plants. There are also some additional vegetation management strategies that are less often used on rights of way for logistical reasons like prescribed fire, grazing, haying, and brush removal, but these can also be really important in maintaining plant diversity and supporting pollinators, and different states use them to different degrees and in different situations for sure. This case study comes from Washington State Department of Transportation. They use iPads with their roadside crews to collect spatial data on plants on their roadsides and revisit those inventories every year to help them fine-tune their weed management approach. In the image that you see here, this is a roadside in Western Washington, and you can see native camas in bloom. And there's some native grasses and some native shrubs in this, but there's also the invasive Scotch broom shrub, which is a really noxious weed and can be really dominant. They found that in roadsides that they were mowing routinely, that Scotch broom just took over, and they recognized that they had to take a different approach. So they did the opposite. They stopped mowing, and they now mow once or twice every decade. And each time they mow, they follow up the cut Scotch broom with an application of herbicide that's targeted, and they'll revisit the Scotch broom plants that are still there to treat them as needed. But Scotch broom has a really long seed bank, so it takes several decades for it to disappear completely. So instead of routine mowing, they've moved to more targeted herbicide applications that have been much more effective for them. But they're constantly revisiting their management approaches based on what they've observed and adapting it over time and conducting training and updating their management plans so that their staff can keep up with the changes. But a really nice informed approach. All right, so in addition to maintenance, protecting and amplifying the habitat that's already on roadsides, revegetation, designing revegetation projects with pollinators in mind can be really beneficial as well. And revegetation is simply just getting plants installed after construction on bare soil. The primary objectives of revegetation are first and foremost road safety, driver safety and function, but also erosion control, water retention, weed control, and visual enhancement. And all those objectives can be met while also increasing pollinator habitat, and also some other ecological goals like carbon sequestration. And so revegetation that supports pollinators can be installed on highway rights of way or in rest areas or cloverleaf interchanges as living snow fences in key areas to stop and capture blowing snow, ornamental plantings in city entryways, or on non-right-of-way land holdings that DOTs have. And native plants can be considered as a management tool for some of the goals of revegetation and also for maintenance as well, because they're really effective at stabilizing soil and can establish in what is often pretty poor soil that follows construction activities. They usually need less inputs, certainly less nutrients, sometimes less water to get established than many introduced species. So they can be easier to get going. They have deeper roots, which allow better water infiltration, which can be a huge advantage for states that need to replenish groundwater, for example, and also can be used to capture snow for that. They can be really resistant to weed encroachment, which can be helpful over time for reducing maintenance costs. A really neat thing about native plants, especially blooming plants, is they can help with driver safety by reducing monotony. There are actually fewer crashes on roads with more diverse plantings on roadsides than with turf grass, for example. And from a pollinator's perspective, pollinator abundance and diversity is greater on roadsides with native plants. So with revegetation projects, whenever possible, it's important to prioritize native plants and to source them locally if at all possible. It can be in some parts of the country and in some states a challenge to source local plant material at the quantity that DOTs need. So communication with plant producers early and often is really a key part of that, so they can grow out what DOTs need. Increasing diversity of flowering plants in revegetation projects is really important for pollinators. Unsurprisingly, grasses have always been sort of a mainstay of revegetation projects, but wildflowers can be important as well on roadsides, and shrubs and trees too, depending on where they're planted within the right of way. For example, in seed mixes in prairie states, it can be important to have a ratio of about 1:1 of grasses and wildflowers. You can get pretty effective erosion control with that, but also those grasses won't outcompete wildflowers as much as higher ratios of grasses to wildflowers. Of course, it's important to include a diversity of flowering plants that have sequential bloom time, so that you've got something blooming in the spring, in the summer, and in the fall. And if your goal is to support butterflies and moths, to include host plants and support plants that provide bees with nesting materials as well. Other considerations for revegetation that benefits pollinators include thinking about, if you've got limited funding to invest in native plant material, to think about where to prioritize where you might use that. You might use it on wider sites first, so that you have much larger habitat areas available. You might focus on using it in sites that are more visible to the public if that's a goal of your project. Avoid really busy and dense interchanges where there's lots of traffic to reduce the pollution. Or prioritize it based on connectivity to existing habitat patches, or sites that have lower weed pressure. There are just lots of considerations if you're thinking about prioritizing places to put habitat. Planning becomes really key with revegetation, designing your mixes and your plantings based on plants that are going to be really suitable for your site, making sure to match the plant with the soil and moisture needs of the site. Weed control can be really important. Some states opt to control weeds during construction or right before construction to help eliminate some of the weeds in the seed bank, as well as after. So coordination with maintenance becomes really important, making sure that the designers are talking with the staff that are going to be on the ground, so they know how to maintain the vegetation that establishes over time, and also aid vegetation establishment success. And lastly, not every agency has experience working with native plants and restoring native plants and getting them started on roadsides. So working with local partners can be really helpful to build that expertise, or to learn from neighboring DOTs that do have some expertise and experience. And all this involves training staff whenever possible to help them feel more comfortable with these approaches and develop their own expertise. This case study comes from Ohio, which is a state that had little expertise in-house initially to establish wildflowers on roadsides. Most of their roads are dominated by cool season grasses that are introduced. But 8 or so years ago, they had a couple staff people that were really passionate about getting wildflowers established for pollinators, to support pollinators. And so they started out small with test plots, and then they moved to plantings within each district and signage, and they located them to make them really visible to the public, and talked with the public about why they were doing them. So they had broad public support to start with initially, but their maintenance crews didn't quite understand the difference at first, because they were used to just mowing on a regular basis every other month to keep those cool season grasses shorter during the growing season. So maintenance managers got creative with how they communicated with their staff. They put up some really nice posters in equipment sheds and in offices that indicate the timing and amount of mowing. And they also created these window clings that could be put on the inside of mowing equipment. And they direct when to mow and where to mow and why, with more information at this QR code. So it's a really creative way to help maintenance crews keep up to speed and remind them to not operate on autopilot when they're mowing. This case study is from Arizona. The Arizona DOT has a really long history of using native plants on roadsides. So they have plenty of expertise in-house, a really amazing expertise, and pretty routinely very diverse seed mixes with 15 to 25 species of native plants, and pretty high ratio of forbs to grasses. So lots of diversity of flowering plants in their mixes. And over time, they've been able to drive down the costs and make those mixes more affordable and have more availability of more species, because they've developed really committed relationships to using locally sourced plant materials. So they've worked with and committed to using plant materials over time for such a long time that relationship has really allowed plant material producers to branch out to find more species to produce and to produce at larger quantities. And it's just been a really beneficial thing overall. They also coordinate really well in advance with those native plant producers to make sure that materials are available. And they put specifications into contracts about substitutions. So if there are crop failures and some native species aren't available in the quantities they need, there's an appropriate substitute available so they don't end up with something of lesser quality. Arizona also writes weed control into their construction specifications. And again, this is helpful so that contractors are required to do weed control prior to construction or during, or even after, so that weeds are removed and native plants have a better chance to establish. Public perception of native vegetation and reduced mowing on roadsides can be mixed. There's a predominant mindset that lawns are sort of the standard in the US of tidiness and aesthetics. And this can extend to the roadside. So some people complain if the vegetation is not short enough, or while native plants are getting established, it looks a little bit more scruffy. So just as a side note, if you appreciate native plants on your roadsides, reach out to your DOT or to your municipality that manages your roadsides to share that positive feedback, because they often only get negative feedback about roadsides as well as potholes, but they are forced to make decisions sometimes on that negative feedback. For example, there are several state colleges in the Great Plains and Midwest area where I'm based that make the decision to mow roadsides regularly in the late summer and the fall because they get negative comments from people coming in to watch football games, which is pretty ridiculous. And this is where DOTs can really highlight the work that they're doing with adding native plants or reducing mowing and linking it to pollinators. And that can be a huge benefit to them, because pollinators have really broad public support. So anything DOTs can do to highlight the good work that they're doing for pollinators can be really helpful for them. Pollinators are more visible to the public than now more than ever. People donate their time to work with kids and to survey bumblebees to further pollinator health. It's really very, very exciting. People are also willing to donate money as well. There was a study that found that US households value monarchs to the tune of about $6 billion, which is levels at which people are willing to donate to support endangered vertebrates. So pollinators are really popular right now. So DOTs can share the work that they're doing through websites. The Minnesota DOT has a pollinator page, for example, or through videos. Oklahoma DOT and Illinois, Nebraska DOT have some informational videos that highlight pollinator habitat on their roadsides, or through signage, license plates, brochures, publications, booklets. These are all really good educational opportunities for DOTs to connect people in the state and visitors with wildflowers, with pollinators, and with what the DOT is doing to support them. In some states like Texas and Florida, wildflower tourism is important. Coming up in a month or so, bluebonnets in Texas will be blooming, and there are some towns in Texas that have bluebonnet festivals to bring in people and so forth. West Virginia DOT offers a Roadsides in Bloom calendar, and they have a photography contest every year to see which photographs get included into that calendar. So again, that's a really nice way to spread awareness of roadside flowers. All of these conservation activities really require good executive support within an agency. Safety is the focus of transportation, and sometimes management doesn't always get around to supporting environmental goals, but recognizing that roadsides are the interface between roads and the environment and can be really crucial is really important. So staff training is always an important part of creating internal consensus and keeping communication open between the people that design roadsides and the people that maintain them is really important as well. There has been legislation focusing on roadsides and pollinators. In 2015, the transportation bill encouraged management practices to support pollinators and the use of native plants as well. And it was just language, there was no funding associated with it, but it definitely pushed DOTs in that direction. Most recently in 2021, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act included funding or established a grant program. It did not actually include funding, but it established a grant program that could provide funding to DOTs to adjust maintenance practices or establish native plants in support of pollinators. So this is a neat grant program that could provide about $5 million a year to applicants when it's up and running, if it gets funds that are allocated from Congress. So we'll see. Some resources to end with. Federal Highway Administration has a vegetative management toolkit, and they have a subsection that's devoted to pollinators where you can find best management practices, the literature review, and an interview report. And I think that that's linked through this conference as well. Federal Highway Administration also has a revegetation manual that was developed in collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service, WSP with Xerces, and the Chicago Botanic Garden. And this focuses on revegetation, everything from designing during the planning process to doing surveys for soil, figuring out what species to use, installing plant materials, and then monitoring plant establishment afterwards. It's been peer reviewed by restoration specialists as well as DOTs for usability. So it's a really amazing resource, and it's available at this website, nativerevegetation.org. It's not a paper, not available as paper anymore. Federal Highways no longer prints documents. It's just all digital at this point. At that same website, nativerevegetation.org, Federal Highway also has an ecoregional revegetation application tool. This is a tool to help people find native plants that are local to their area and then decide which plants have the attributes they need for their particular restoration project. So you can search for plants within an ecoregion. Pictured here is a Southern Rocky ecoregion, or you could select your state and search by Nebraska plants, or you can even search by county. And I'm in Douglas County, so it would produce a list of all the plants found in Douglas County. And you can filter it through that website and then download it after that, or you can download the whole list of all the plants in your county, state, or ecoregion, and then sort through by the plant attributes that you're looking for as well. It does include data on pollinators, including nectar plants to support monarchs or host plants for different butterflies and plants that are attractive to bees or to other species of pollinators as well. There are also some monarch specific resources through a National Cooperative Highway Research Program, project that Monarch Joint Venture led a few years back. Regional roadside milkweed recognition guides that highlight the most common milkweeds that are found on roadsides. And some of these are really incredibly disturbance tolerant milkweeds, but there are also some really cool conservative milkweeds too. So those can be a really nice resource. There's also a Monarch and herbicide fact sheet available. And Monarch Joint Venture has a prioritization tool for selecting sites and habitat evaluation tools as well. And so the final thoughts I want to leave you with are that, of course, the roadsides can be really important to pollinators, but beyond that, beyond pollinators, they are just providing a whole host of ecological services across a lot of different landscapes. In addition to ecological services, they're contributing to cultural services, to providing health benefits and showcasing regional beauty. They can be an opportunity to mitigate the negative impacts of roads. They can be assets to departments of transportation, and I'm hoping that departments of transportation can begin to see themselves as land management agencies, since they manage hundreds of acres of roadsides. And roadsides can be an asset to the states and to ecosystems at large. So with that, I want to say thank you so much to the DOT staff who have informed some of this work, and the funding from Federal Highway Administration and the National Cooperative Highway Research Program administered by Transportation Research Board. And if there's time, I'm happy to answer questions.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, with the loss of biodiversity and so many humans and cement on the planet, we really have to look at roadsides as a big habitat area.
Yeah, that's right.
So yesterday we had the honor of Christine Nemec from Iowa to speak on roadsides, and she had mentioned that in terms of wildlife, small animals, and birds, that having habitat on the roadsides actually reduced collisions.
Oh, okay. So for just beyond pollinators, it works for other slightly larger animals too. That's really interesting. I didn't know that about birds or small mammals, but yeah, that's pretty interesting.
So, and then you were talking about the fact that pollinators have less mortality because of increased plant diversity in the roadsides. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, well, this is definitely an area where research could be more needed, because I don't think that it's the cause behind that is known. It's speculated that it's because the higher quality vegetation provides more habitat. There's less of a need to cross the road specifically to find resources on the other side of the road. You can travel more within that corridor to find resources. And that's also the hypothesis behind why reduced mowing is beneficial to creating fewer vehicle collisions, because once that habitat is mown down, pollinators have to find a new place to go. So the less often you mow during the growing season, the less often you disrupt their habitat.
And then alternatively, the middle or the medians of the roadside is the opposite situation.
Well, we don't really know. There is a study that came out a couple years ago that just looked at if medians were vegetated versus not vegetated. So they didn't look at necessarily the quality of vegetation, but they did find that vegetated medians had more collisions than paved medians. So it's really an open question, and I think there are a lot of questions to consider around pollinator mortality on roadsides, especially if we know there's a hot spot, a place where there's more collisions that occur than others. For example, are there mitigation methods that are possible to implement? Like, could you move a strip of vegetation along a highway overpass, or a wildlife overpass like you have often in the West? Could that help pollinators as well? Or could you use certain fencing to help them to fly up over at a height that causes them to steer clear of vehicles? Really, there hasn't been any experimentation with those types of mitigation methods. So that's an open area of research for sure.
Okay. So what about the the effects of nearby ag lands. There's some areas where there are miles and miles of industrial agriculture right along the roadside, and pesticide drift is obviously a threat to pollinators. But does pollinator habitat and maybe hedgerows or tree lines, how does that fit in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's also an area of would be a really nice area for more research. If you've got, some farmers, and in fact in Iowa, they had a really neat program, although this was several decades ago, to work with farmers to install a row of trees or shrubs right up against their fence line if they had land that was adjacent to a right-of-way, so that it could create a living snow fence. And in that way too, it created the screen, a pesticide screen as well. But I think from Emily Snell-Rude's lab in the University of Minnesota, I think that she's finding that there is some movement of pesticides into roadside vegetation, but it might not necessarily be at levels that we would have predicted based on what the landscape looks like. So, but it would be really nice to see other studies outside of Minnesota to see what that looks like too.
Okay. And what do you think, how big of a barrier is it to implement these roadside programs in states and counties where the current maintenance staff or crew may or may not be cooperative or educated? Is that a huge barrier?
Yeah, it definitely can be. And that's where I think having that support higher up can be so important. And, Iowa has a really neat system where they've been able to engage counties and support the counties that are interested. For states that have interest, they have roadside managers that have interest. I think they've been able to create interest and support at higher levels with executives within their agency in recent years, because there have been increased listings of pollinators. And so that's meant that they've needed to think about proactive ways to either support pollinators or prepare for more species to get listed, which might impact their projects. So it's just become more of a logistical issue that they've needed to consider. So that's one way that some people that haven't been on board have needed to think about it further.
So the possibility of a species going on the endangered species list and then being found in the roadside area that they manage could be more expensive and problematic if they hadn't planned for it ahead.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So DOTs that are now taking steps to protect pollinators whenever they can, that provides them with some regulatory assurances if they're working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife in advance. So that can really be useful for them in the event of a future listing. And if it doesn't get listed, hopefully all of their efforts are recovering that species, or helping to contribute to recover that species.
Right, it's all good.
That's right, no downsides.
So what about heavy salt applications? In Minnesota, there's legislation going through right now to try to prevent some of that. Is that having an effect on both the habitat and the pollinators?
Yeah, and I really can't speak to habitat beyond terrestrial habitat, but I know that salt moving into waterways can be a really big problem for aquatic life. But with regards to pollinators, salt does move from the road into the vegetation adjacent to the road, and then plants do pick it up. So if a caterpillar is to eat a plant that has picked up that salt, it has more sodium content in it. And for some caterpillars, they're pretty salt tolerant. And it isn't a huge issue, but there's definitely a threshold of salt at which it can be problematic for caterpillars and the developing adult butterfly. But it looks like for the most part, the levels of salt aren't at a problematic level at vegetation, nearest beyond that safety zone next to the pavement. So there was a study, for example, a couple years ago that found that monarch butterflies actually had slightly larger brains on vegetation with higher sodium because sodium is a nutrient that's often limited for them. So it's kind of a complex story, but the short story is that it can move from the road into vegetation, and some plants can be incredibly salty. It's not often at levels that harm pollinators, but occasionally it can be in really areas where there's lots of salt. A larger issue is that salty vegetation can be really attractive to large mammals. So the last thing you want is a way to attract large mammals to the sides of roads. So that's another downside, but yeah, there also aren't a lot of alternatives to using salt on roads yet.
I was told yesterday, Christine mentioned that actually deer are more interested in going to a mowed area because it's easier to access the sort of vegetation that they want rather than, a grown, established prairie area.
Yes, deer really like mown new, fresh growth. So the older growth in a lot of roadsides is less attractive for them as places to eat.